Hi, how are you? I'm Anthony from Cypher House Escape, and today I'm back with another Puzzled Pint set. This time I'm doing the set from January of 2021. The theme was Puzzfeed, of course a reference to Buzzfeed. Now, as with the last time that I solved a Puzzled Pint set, I'm solving this set on pencil and paper with all of the resources that I might have at a bar or restaurant, which is the locations where Puzzled Pint is meant to take place. So I won't have hundreds of tabs open, Googling several different possible answers, and using a multitude of tools to help me solve this hunt. It's just going to be things that I could easily access on my phone, like maybe a quick one-look search or a quick Google search, but probably nothing too extensive, because that's how the Puzzled Pint sets are intended to be solved. I do have one slight change to the format, though, from the last Puzzled Pint video. I wasn't very happy with the audio quality that I was able to get from that video, so I decided that instead of having me solve the puzzle and comment on it all in one take, I solved the puzzle on camera, and now I'm going to watch back the footage here on camera and explain what I was doing as I went through. This hopefully means that I'll be able to more clearly explain my thought process, since I can pause the video and comment on specific points of interest. And it also has the added benefit of knowing that the time that it took me to solve these puzzles won't be as affected by me having to constantly pause and explain what I'm doing. It was just me focusing solely on trying to solve the puzzles in as little time as possible. With this additional time freedom, I decided to set the challenge for myself to complete this Puzzled Pint set in just 1 hour. The rules for this challenge are that I have to at least attempt all 4 feeder puzzles. If I get stuck on a feeder puzzle, I have to spend at least 10 minutes trying to solve it before moving on to the meta puzzle. I can get a better time by solving these puzzles and getting their final answer in under 10 minutes. Okay, so with that, let's jump into the video. I'm starting my timer, and I start taking a look at this first puzzle called 10 Inkblot Drawings Whose Symmetry Will Astound You. Now, this puzzle wasn't an easy one for me. The flavor text reads, "Wow, these Rorschach pictures all have mirror symmetry." And I, of course, noticed that we have all these images that seem to be mirrored across the vertical axis, and that every single one was 6 letters long. But I didn't really know how to apply the symmetry of the image to the actual answers that I was supposed to get. I started to fill in some of the easier ones, including walrus and magnet. I was initially trying to spot patterns with the various words. I was hoping that the words themselves might be mirrored across the x-axis, like the first and last letter might be the same, but I was noticing that the words that I was getting weren't mirrored across this central axis in any way. After filling in a few more answers, I noticed that these letters that are given on the right column show up in a unique position inside of the words on the right. So there's the U in guitar, the M in magnet, the L in walrus, and the Z in wizard. So I put a little arrow under those because I assumed those were going to be important for the solve. And I assumed that my goal was to figure out what these question mark letters were over on the left. But I didn't know how to map these over from one side to the other. I initially thought that this word in the left column was shades. It seemed to be pointed to the window shades, but that answer is actually wrong. While looking up one of the answers here, I get a brief visit from my cat, so that was entertaining. I filled in the word tennis, and I was having a little bit of trouble getting these 2 words in the middle of each column. And then I had an idea for how I could make these words have potentially mirror symmetry, except for perhaps maybe one of these letters. So rather than the first and the last letter being the same, like a G and a G, I bring in my Puzzled Pint code sheet and wonder if perhaps if I wrote these letters in Morse code or binary or semaphore or pigpen, if I mirror imaged them across the x-axis, if a G looked like an R in any of those languages. That turned out to not be at all correct, but that's what I'm trying here. A little bit over 10 minutes in, I decided that I wasn't making any progress on this puzzle. Fortunately, it was still the first puzzle, so I had some other feeders that I could look at, and so I decided to put this one to the side and give my brain a break on thinking about symmetry to look at some other puzzles instead. I will come back to that first puzzle later. So I bring out this second puzzle. This alignment test will help you find your place in the afterlife. And of course I noticed initially that there's these bolded words in several of the cells. So I'm kind of taking a look around at those bolded words. I also noticed that in the center, it says something about waving flags. So immediately I was thinking semaphore, I also noticed that it says in the flavor text, who's the third member of your party. I counted how many bolded words there were around the outside and found there were 26. I assumed they were in pairs, and so that meant there's 13 pairs. There's also the 13 letters in the central box, so I knew this was all connected in some way. And eventually I find this pair of me, myself, and I. I knew that I would be the third entry. So these two squares make this L shape, which is the semaphore letter for J here I'm finding on the sheet. And so I'm putting a letter J beside the letter I in that central box. And now I'm going to continue to look for pairs that might have a third entry that's missing. I have here animal, vegetable, and mineral, which starts with the letter M. I find silver, bronze, and G for gold. And I find a few other pairs, small, medium, and L for large, queen, jack, and K for king, trains, planes, and automobiles, hop, skip, and a jump, signed, sealed, delivered. And at this point, I've decoded enough of the semaphore letters to start to be able to fill in what the final answer might be here. I noticed that the first several letters were spelling answer, and I assumed these next two were spelling is, and I got lucky that I decoded these last 5 letters fairly early on, because I saw that those last 5 letters spelled Janet, which is the final answer to this puzzle. Puzzle 3 is called What's Your Love Language? And it talks about the 5 different love languages, which are words of affirmation, quality time, receiving gifts, acts of service, and physical touch. I noticed that it says that these various entries have been changed in some way, and the first one that caught my eye is this line at the bottom, where I noticed the final letter of all these words was deleted from drummer star of the Beatles. The answer is, of course, Ringo, but I did the same transformation to the answer Ringo that was done to the rest of these words, and that just left me with the answer ring. At this point, I turned my attention to the bottom of the page, and I noticed that these various symbols are representing the 5 love languages. The first one is words of affirmation, the second is quality time, we have receiving gifts, acts of service, and then physical touch. And a ring, I realized, fit into the category of a gift that somebody might give a loved one. So I filled ring into the only spot that it could fit in that line. The next clue that I find is small pool of rainwater. Every initial letter was replaced with a C. So puddle gets changed into cuddle, which is a form of physical touch. The next one that I noticed was this line was changed from Halloween outfit. There was an R added at the end of every word, and I noticed that the first 2 vowels were always changed in each word. I never quite figured out how these vowels were being transformed, but I knew that we would have an R at the end of our word, and that the answer was costume, so I left in most of the letters for costume. I assumed that the E towards the end would be unchanged, as these E's in Halloween were unchanged. And the most prominent answer was customer, so I just guessed kind of that customer was the answer to this one. And then I struggled to figure out exactly where customer would go. The next line that I solve is this one at the bottom, where I noticed that the third letter had always been shifted 1 position in the alphabet. The final clue is valve puzzle game that lies about cake, and the answer is portal. By shifting the third letter 1 position, we get postal, and at this point I realized that postal service is a thing, and customer service is also a thing, so I put both postal and customer into the service category. For this line, I noticed that the last 2 letters were always swapped. We have climate activist Thunberg, and I didn't know who that was off the top of my head, so I used my phone to Google, and that activist is Greta. If we switch the last 2 letters, we get great, which is a word of affirmation. Next, I take a look at this second line, where I notice that a G has been added to the end of every word, and the second to last letter has also been changed to an I. The clue is company founded by Jeff Bezos, and the answer is Amazon. Replacing that second from the last letter with an I and adding a G gives amazing, another word of affirmation. At this point, I began to look at the letters that I had in the hearts at the bottom and noticed that the same trick was being used, where it starts with the answer is, and then the answer is spelled out after that point. Again, I got lucky by happening to have a lot of the letters from the final answer as some of the first things that I solved. And so I noticed this NUP, 3 spaces, and then the L, and I assumed that the answer was nuptial. Except it turns out that I've been spelling that word wrong for most of my life. The answer is nuptial, Nuptial, but I spelled it nuptial, which is Nuptual. This is apparently a fairly common misspelling, at least that's what Wikipedia tells me, but it still is embarrassing. I noticed the mistake later on in the video. So I jump into puzzle 4 at this point. This puzzle is called Solve This Dialect Puzzle and will tell you where you were born. The flavor text reads, "We've filled this dialect map with words. A lot of them are analogous of each other." And then we see that there's what appears to be an example between 4 entries here in the grid. We have nickel, dime, cup, and pint. And at this point, I'm just kind of saying those words in my head, trying to figure out what's going on here. And I realized that analogous is referring to analogies here. Nickel is to dime. It's half of a dime, as cup is to pint, because a cup is half of a pint. I also took note that each of these 4 entries in this analogy are evenly spaced apart. You always moved 3 spaces to the right to get to the next entry in the analogy, so I assumed that all of these analogies would be evenly spaced apart in one of the rows or columns. The first one that I find is yesterday is to past, as today is to present. I fill in the answer present. And again, these are all evenly spaced apart. They're just 2 spaces away from each other. I crossed out the 3 answers that I used initially in the analogy because that's what they did in the example, but I left present uncrossed because I assumed that this would get used in another analogy further down the line. The next thing that I noticed is that we had 2 houses from Harry Potter, Hufflepuff and Gryffindor, along this diagonal. And so I concluded that these analogies don't just have to be going across rows or columns, they could be going along diagonal lines as well. So Hufflepuff is to badger, because that's the animal of that house, as Gryffindor is to lion, the animal of that house. And at this point, I noticed that lion is right next to loin, and that those 2 are very similar in that they have very similar letters, just the middle 2 have been swapped. And so I realized that I can also make analogies going to the left. Lion is to loin as flim is to film. It takes me a bit of time to find another analogy, and this one in particular is interesting. I noticed that Mars and planet are a knight's move away from each other, 2 to the left and 1 down. And if I continue in that way, I get to April and then to a blank space. And I realized that these analogies can be formed in even more complex patterns. So Mars is to planet as April is to month. That leads me to this pattern, year is to month as foot is to inch. And I continue to fill in these analogies for the rest of the puzzle. Here I got lamina is to animal because they're reversed, as rep is to per. We have air is to air, just homophones, as sign is to sign, sign. And now I'm noticing that if we move 2 along this diagonal, sign and ensign have very similar letters, just the en's been added to the front. And then tree, if you add the en to the front, gives entree. Next, I find that present is to registry, as in you might put a present on a wedding registry, as entree is to menu. The next one that I find is lightning is to Thor, because Thor is the god of lightning, as trickery is to Loki. At this point, I start thinking about the answer, which I assume is this star in the lower left corner, and I try to start thinking about how I'm going to form an analogy out of the remaining words and spaces that's going to lead me to that star, and I find that there only seems to be 1 set of blank spaces that leads me in a straight line to that star. At least using things that I haven't already used. And so I put a star next to these 3 blank spaces to let me know that that's the important final analogy that I need to figure out. It takes me a while to find my next analogy, but I find that pint is to pit by just deleting the N, as mental is to metal by deleting the N. I was having a bit of trouble at this point finding new analogies, and I decided to look up if Denver was related to cocoa in any way. because I noticed Denver and Harrisburg were both cities, but I couldn't figure out what Coco had to do with Denver. I thought maybe it was a sporting team or something, and tried to look it up on my phone, and that's when I realized that CO is just the abbreviation for Colorado, which is where Denver's located. The abbreviation for Harrisburg State is PA, and so just like Coco had the CO doubled, we double the PA to get Papa. I find this next analogy, which is game is to tied if the score is even, whereas a jury is hung if they can't make a decision on the jury. I next start looking for where this answer glass that feels kind of isolated in the top corner could still possibly have 3 other spaces that I haven't used yet to form an analogy, and I notice it has to be glass, bottle, and metal blank, and so I guess that blank is probably can, a metal container, whereas bottle is the glass container. This puzzle took me quite a long time to get through. It didn't feel like it at the time because honestly, this is a very creative puzzle and I really enjoyed solving it. I had a lot of fun with this one. The next set that I notice is can is to canary by adding the ARY, as hung is to Hungary, and that's one of my starred answers that's eventually going to lead down to the final answer. So I know now that I'm thinking about countries potentially as the final answer. My first thought was capitals, but I didn't know that for certain. So I wanted to get some of these other starred answers before taking that guess. Next, I noticed that does could also be pronounced does, and does are the female version of bucks, while women are the female version of men. Now I can go down this column. Men is to menu, as per is to Peru. That's another starred entry, and so I'm now certain that I'm looking at countries here. I have Peru and Hungary, but I still needed a bit of evidence for what this second to last answer was here. Because I didn't know if maybe we were going with continents that these countries were in, or capitals, or something else that is related to these two countries. So I find sprinkle is to pike by just taking every other letter of the word sprinkle, as attorney is to Tony. And then play is to Tony, because the Tonys are the awards that plays get, as film is to Oscar. Now at this point, I decide it's time to take a leap to get to the final answer a little faster. I still have 4 or 5 analogies to finish up here, but I notice Oscar and Papa are both letters of the NATO alphabet, and that O comes immediately before P. The next 2 spaces are this blank space that I don't have yet, and the last entry is this starred entry that is the second one of the final analogy. So I'm thinking about the NATO alphabet, and most notably, I'm thinking about how L in the NATO alphabet is Lima, which is also the capital of Peru. If this analogy is meant to be the letter before in the NATO alphabet, the letter before Lima is Kilo, and that looked like it was really closely related to Loki. It's just an anagram of Loki. So I assume inch was going to be anagrammed here to get something in this blank, and then Loki is anagrammed to get kilo. And so I assume at this point I'm fairly safe, even though I'm still missing a couple analogies. And we have Peru is to Lima, as Hungary is to Budapest. I decided to bring the first puzzle back in, and I noticed that these words on the left all have these double letters that seem to be mirrored across that vertical axis. And so I circled those. Surfer, of course, doesn't have that pattern, but I guessed that surfer might actually be surfs with an ES, even though I don't think that's spelled right. I plug it in just because I'm kind of at a loss for what else to do on this puzzle. And after staring at this puzzle in this state for another 5 minutes or so, I decided that it's probably time to give up on this puzzle and move on to the meta puzzle. So I bring out the meta puzzle and I write in all of my answers along the top of the page that I have so far, and I start to read the instructions. Meta behavioral temperament inspection. I see that the goal is that we have to fit our answers into this grid, each one starting in one of these dotted line spaces. And I see that there's some rules, like no letter can be repeated in a row or column, and then there's a number of traits, different personality traits that each of the answers can have. They can be introverted, extroverted, feelers, thinkers, and so on. I wasn't immediately sure how to apply these traits to the various answers. As I sat here and stared at this, I counted the number of letters that would go into this grid. It's 25 because it's a 5x5 grid, and I counted the number of letters that I had in my answers so far, which was 20. So I said, okay, so the answer to that first puzzle is indeed 5 letters. I do probably have to find what those 5 question marks are. And as I'm sitting here looking at this meta puzzle, I realized that it's going to be kind of hard to complete it without having all 4 answers. I happened to glance over at that first puzzle again, and I realized something about this first puzzle. So I bring the first puzzle back on, and I realized that these double letter pairs were completely on the wrong track. Instead, I noticed that at the end of walrus is RUS, and at the beginning of surf is SUR. And all of these images are only kind of mirror imaged on the far right and far left. Like, we're missing the middle parts of these images completely. It's only the left side, for example, and the right side, for example, that need to be mirror images of each other. So in this case, this SUR and this RUS from walrus are related. Now, I assume that these letters that I drew the arrow to, that were, again, indicated by these letters beside the images, are telling us which letter to extract from the matching word on the left. So here I take the letter L from walrus, maps over to the letter F from surfer, which I think is still supposed to be surfer, and I get the letter F there. Now guitar matches to rattle because the RAT and TAR, and this U in guitar is going to give us the L from rattle. Magnet and tennis gives us the letter S. Saucer and recipe gives us the letter I. And then wizard, at this point I noticed that shades is probably wrong. This has to be something that starts with DRA. I realize that's drapes, and therefore that the last letter that I need is a P for flips. So I add flips to my list of answers for the meta puzzle and start thinking about how to assign a personality trait to each of these words. I also notice my misspelling of nuptial at this point and replace that U with an I. So when thinking about these personalities, I of course noticed that there's a bolded letter for every personality trait that's listed here. It took a couple minutes of thinking, but I eventually realized that every answer has exactly one of the letters in each pair. So introvert and extrovert is an I and an E. If we look at Janet, there's no I's, but there is an E. Budapest, no I's, but there is an E. So it easily fits into one of these 2 categories of bolded letters. So I start looking at Budapest because it's the longest answer, and I see that Budapest has to be an extrovert, meaning that it's only going to run along outer cells. And again, it has to start in one of these dotted line sections. So I quickly count some squares, and I notice that Budapest can't start in either the top left corner or the top center square, because there's nowhere for it to go that keeps it only along the outside of the grid. Instead, it has to start in either this cell or this cell, and specifically it has to run along the bottom and right edge of the grid here. I count how many spaces I have and how many letters are in Budapest, and I realize that all of these spaces, along with either the square down here at the bottom or the square at the top, are going to be part of the answer Budapest. Next, I switch over to looking at nuptial because that's the next longest word, but that turned out to be one of the harder ones to place, and I soon switch over to looking at Janet. The reason I looked at Janet is because Janet is the only judger, meaning Janet's the only one that won't have any turns like this in the grid. Janet's going to run in a completely straight line. The only 2 places that Janet can go, that we have 5 letters in a straight line, is either from this bottom square running up, or from this top left square running down. And Janet is also an extrovert, meaning that that answer is only going to be entered along the outer edges of the grid. So I noticed that Janet has to fit in over here. We're 1 minute away from that hour time limit, by the way. At this point, I was very nervous that I wasn't going to finish. I was pretty sure that I wasn't going to finish on time, but I was also aware of how close it really was going to be. The next thing that I noticed is that Janet is an intuitor, because there's an N in that answer. So I know that Janet has to be adjacent to all of the other answers. So if Budapest starts at this top right corner, Budapest and Janet are not touching, meaning the only way that Budapest can go is to start in this bottom left corner. So I fill in the answer Budapest along the line that I previously drew. So just after the 1 hour mark, I realized that I failed my challenge and I start to go at a bit of a more leisurely pace. I wasn't quite sure where to fit nuptial and flips into the grid because they both don't have very many constraints in terms of the personality traits. They can both go inside of the grid. Flips can even move diagonally. They can both make turns, like Budapest made this angled turn over here. And eventually I realized that there's this additional constraint at the start that no letter may repeat within a row or column. My approach here was not an exhaustive one. I was just kind of guessing because nuptial had to be written in orthogonal directions with no diagonals. I just kind of guessed that nuptial might fit here to be able to touch all of the other answers. And so then I set out to see if I could put flips into this section without repeating a letter in any row or column. I know flips couldn't go to the left because there was already an L there, but if you go down, up to the left, and then down and down to the right, that fits flips into the grid there. The last step was to read out the letters that are in these numbered squares in order. I assumed that that would spell out the final answer, and this should give us an answer to the results of our personality test. The answer is passed it. So we passed our personality test. That's good. We have a personality. The final time for that solve was 1 hour and 2 minutes, so just barely over that challenge time of 1 hour. Overall, this set was a lot of fun. I really liked the analogy puzzle. I thought that one was particularly creative and clever. To end out the video, I'm going to play a time-lapse of me solving the bonus puzzle at the end of this set of Puzzled Pint puzzles, which was a variety logic puzzle. Let me know your thoughts about this puzzle set down in the comments section, or if you have any format ideas for how I can solve future Puzzled Pint sets. I have a few format changes and challenges that I want to throw into the mix for these Puzzled Pint sets, because they're fun, short, and easy sets of puzzles to get experimental and try some interesting things with. But otherwise, that wraps it up for this video. Thank you so much for watching, have a great day, and as always, happy escaping.